Hello and welcome to Lecture 1 for Topic 10, Chapter 7. And in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the news media and democracy. So what are we going to be learning about in this lecture? Well, in this lecture, we're going to learn about the role that the news media plays in a democracy. And we're also going to look at any checks that are placed on the power of the media. Your textbook identifies three major roles that the news media plays in a democracy. They identify that the news media, one role they play is the role of informing the people that live within the democracy. Another is that the news media serves as a watchdog of the other branches of government as well as other entities within our society. And that finally, that the news media provides a public forum for debate. So let's take a look at each of these roles that the news media plays in more detail. So as we've been discussing out throughout the course of this semester, that there are certain qualities that democracies must have to ensure that they are in fact democratic. And one of the things we've talked about is voting rights, that since democracy is government of, for, and by the people, the people need to have a significant say in the decisions that are made, and a lot of times their voices are heard through the process of voting. But another aspect of a quality that's necessary for living in a democracy is that when people vote or take action, that the actions that they take are informed and reasonable. And so democracies need voting rights, but they also need informed voters that hold reasoned opinions. And the news media, at least ideally, provides this necessary information for voters to act in a knowledgeable and informed way. I grew up in the Chicago area, and in Chicago, our public television station was Channel 11, and it was WTTW, Channel 11. And what WTTW stood for was, they said that channel provided a window to the world. And I think that's a good example of the role that news media, at least from a traditional perspective, plays in a democracy. News media is there to hold up to the world, hold a mirror up to the world, and then report out what they see. For the vast majority of us, we can't inform ourselves. We rely on the news media for that information. So we don't have the time to go down to the city hall and sit in on a city council meeting. We don't have time to go down to the state legislature and observe for ourselves. We don't have the resources or really the ability to go to the front lines of a war and observe for ourselves what's going on. And so we rely on the media to do that for us. And the way that they do that is from a journalistic standards perspective, and we'll be talking more about that in a moment, is that they do it in an objective way. They hold up a mirror and then they, without their own subjective opinion about it, report it out to us. The news media also provides analysis, so it will report what's happening, but then it will also place it into context for us and provide a broader analysis of that. And in good news sources, the news analysis pieces will be designated as such. And the news media also provides perspectives on current affairs, current issues, current public policies. And they do that on their editorial page. And so that, and they're usually clearly marked, they should be. And so the news media informs the people, but they also allow the people to provide it an analysis, place it into context, and think about different sides of the perspective or the issue from multiple perspectives. Again, another key feature to being informed. And so with this information and analysis, people can cast informed votes, be knowledgeable about issues, and therefore make what it means to be living in a democracy all the more meaningful and vital, because people aren't just voting, but they're voting in a informed way, and they depend on the news media for that information. Another role that the news media plays in a democracy is that it has a watchdog function. It serves as a watchdog. You might have heard the news media referred to as the fourth estate. And what that means is that the news media, along with the other three estates, we just call them branches, but this is a term that goes back to the middle of the 18th century. that along with the legislature, the executive branch, and the judiciary, that you need the free press in order to have a functioning democracy. And so when you think about the media as the fourth estate, what that oftentimes means is that just as the legislature places a check on the executive, and the executive places a check on the legislature, and the judiciary places sort of a check on both, that the media is there to place a check to check the abuses of power in the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary branch. And so when you say that the news media is the fourth estate, we're often thinking about them as providing some sort of investigatory power to basically let people know what's going on in government and beyond, and so that they can use that information to be further informed in terms of the actions that they take. As a watchdog, what the news media does is that they scrutinize the action of elected officials and other public figures and non-public figures as well. And so news media will do investigative reporting about the actions of government. One of the more recent examples of that was during the Iraq War. Newspapers, in this case it was a news magazine, The New Yorker, they broke a story about the abuses that were going on in the treatment of prisoners at a prison in Iraq. It was called Abu Ghraib prison. And a news reporter got a video footage of some of the ways in which people in that prison were being tortured. And then the news media did an investigation on the abuses of prisoners at Abu Ghraib prison. And then they reported that, and then that led to investigations of the Department of Justice about where these orders were coming from, etc. And so that's an example of the watchdog function of the news media as it relates to the other branches of government. But the news media will also do investigative reporting on the actions of corporations. They'll also, do investigations of non-public figures. For example, there's a movie that you could watch. It's called Spotlight, but it's based on the activities and the investigations of the Boston Globe newspaper. The Boston Globe, it came to their attention that the Boston Archdiocese of the Catholic Church was turning a blind eye to the abuse of children by priests. And the Boston Globe, they did an investigative report on those abuses, bringing that attention, that information to the attention of lawmakers, and serving as this watchdog function, a good example of the watchdog function of a non-public figure. And so how does this fit into democracy? Well, how it fits into democracy is that through investigative reporting, people get the information they need, not just so that they can make informed votes and hold reasoned opinions, but that they'll also have this information in order to hold those who lead us accountable. Again, another important feature of living in a democratic society. The final role that the news media plays in fostering a democratic society is that they serve as a public forum. And so not only does the news media inform the people, but it provides an opportunity to debate political issues and policies. And a lot of times that the news media can serve as sort of a leveling the playing field between political elites and the people that they represent, the common person. Because we don't have a lot of contact with our political leaders, right? We could send them letters, drop them emails, maybe they'll write you back, right? And so the news media sort of levels that playing field by giving them an opportunity to come and participate in a public forum, and also giving people the opportunity to directly address their elected officials in a public forum. And so, some examples of public forums that the news media offer are candidate debates. Now, we've just come out of an election season, and we might just really be tired of candidate debates. But they're very important, depending on the quality of the debate, for us to actually see our elected leaders in action, or our potential elected leaders in action. How do they handle tough questions? Are they able to answer questions? What's your sort of personality like? You can see that in the public forum of candidate debate. The news media will also hold town halls on important issues. And often they will invite elected officials and others to attend those public town halls and broadcast them. I'm thinking in a couple of years recently, some sort of important town halls that were held on CNN. Following the shooting at Marjorie Douglas High School, CNN had a town hall where they invited representatives from the state of legislature, the governor of the state of Florida, and also federal representatives as well. And they also had people on the stage who were affected by the shootings. So it's a really interesting opportunity to sort of again level the playing field and also inform people through this process of debating issues in a public forum. And even coverage of social movements that the news media does can provide a public forum. And so people, be involved in a social movement. And during the process of that social movement, the news media will stop. They'll do interviews, give people an opportunity to, just regular people, to report to the public, what their concerns are and what their issues are. And so all of these, the importance of sort of leveling the playing field and the importance of having an opportunity to deal at least more directly with our elected leaders is another key aspect to why a free press is important for a democracy. It should come as no surprise that the framers recognized the importance of the free press. When the states, prior to becoming states, before we won our independence, the colonies, there was not freedom of speech. There was not freedom of press. You could get in trouble for speaking freely. You could get in trouble for criticizing the king. And so coming out of the revolutionary experience, the founders at the beginning, and then those who were at the Constitutional Convention, the framers, they had a very strong understanding of the importance that a free press plays to democracies. So much so that in the Bill of Rights, the Constitution provides these constitutional protections to the news media. It says that in the First Amendment that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. And you learned about that when we read Chapter 4 and we did coverage of the civil liberties as it relates to the press. There was a whole section of that in the textbook. And what's really kind of interesting about the constitutional protections that are given to the news media in the Bill of Rights is that the press is the only private entity that is explicitly granted protections of liberty in the Constitution. Most of those liberties go to the individuals or the states, but not to a private entity such as the press. And so it shows you sort of the remarkable aspect of those constitutional protections, that they were willing to extend it to an institution. And public opinion reflects that a free press is of great importance to democracy. In Chapter 6, the chapter on public opinion, that there were the questions about what do people think is very important to maintaining a strong democracy. And one of the questions was about the press. And it said that 64% of people in the United States say that it is very important that we have a free press and that the free press is able to criticize elected officials, that they view that as an incredibly important aspect of living in a democracy. So hopefully in this section, you've sort of seen the role that, at least ideally, the news media can play in a democracy and how it is constitutionally embedded in the Bill of Rights, and also as a reflection even today in public opinion. Now, are there any checks on the news media? If we see that the news media wields a lot of power. They determine what stories they're going to cover with their agenda setting power. There are hundreds of stories to cover each year. Which should be covered? Well, the news media decides which are the most important stories to cover. So they make decisions about what they're going to inform us about. They also have this Watchdog function. They can be adversarial and should be adversarial and independent of the government, and investigate both the branches of government and beyond. But as we know, the other three estates, or the three institutions of government, there's a check on those, right? The legislature checks the executive, the judiciary checks the legislature and the executive branch. Well, who checks the media? Are there any checks on the news media? Well, by law, there are very few checks on the news media. That the press is protected by the First Amendment, and so it has wide berth in terms of what it can print, and that's just a reflection of an entity or an individual that gets those constitutionally protected liberties. It's kind of hard to place restraints on it. But as we learned in our chapter on civil liberties, all liberties are subject to some constraints. And so that even though the press is protected by the First Amendment, it's not without limits. That when it comes to any press, newspapers, and also broadcast media, that they're subject to national security threats. And so that while for the most part we don't place prior restraint on the news media, that is that the government doesn't look at what the news media is going to report and then gives them the go-ahead to publish something. That's what that would be prior restraint. Show us first, says the government, then you can print it. That's against the Constitution. That's not unconstitutional. The only area where that might be constitutional is when it comes to national security concerns. In the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, there's a very important case that your textbook talks about called the Pentagon Papers. And so the Pentagon Papers were these papers from the Defense Department that an individual got their hands on, and then they leaked those papers to both the New York Times and the Washington Post. And what was in those papers was showing just how the Defense Department thought that the Vietnam War was unwinnable in terms of the way that the strategies that they were pursuing. And so there was some question about whether or not the newspapers had the authority to print those leaked documents. The big concern is telling people about these documents, does that threaten national security? And that case went to the Supreme Court, and they said the Pentagon Papers don't threaten national security. But there could be other things that threaten national security. So when it comes to printing information or reporting information that threatens national security, there are probably some limitations on the freedom of the press there. The press is also subject to libel and slander laws as well. And so there are limitations there, even though the press has First Amendment protections. We do have the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, that places regulations, but only on broadcast media. If you're a broadcast television station or a broadcast radio station, you have to have a license to broadcast. And when you get that license, you have to abide by certain rules, decency rules and other rules that they talk about in your textbook. But today, most media is not, the FCC regulations don't apply to the newspapers, and cable news is not broadcast, right? And so most media is no longer broadcast media. So even there, the regulations that we have are really sort of losing their power and their teeth because we don't have a lot of examples of broadcast media anymore. Thus, at least legally, there are very few checks on the news media's power. So while there may not be de jure checks on the news media, there are de facto checks on the news media, and how successful these de facto checks are remains up for debate, but I will present both of these here. One of the checks on the news media is a self-check, okay, the self-policing that they do. And that relates to the journalistic standards that news media organizations pride themselves in upholding. And when you go and you're a journalist student, you'll learn what these journalistic standards are. And so journalists are guided by standards in reporting, and it is kind of referred to as traditional hard news reporting. That the journalists have a professional and an ethical responsibility to report the news in a way that is objective and it's also sourced. And so, journalists seek to report truth, and the way that when they're reporting out the truth, they do it by fact checking. And so, if they learn something, so for example, with the Pentagon Papers, if somebody sent a journalist a bunch of, Xerox copies of something from the Defense Department, well, that journalist wouldn't just say, "Oh, wow, look at these papers," and report on them. They would do fact checking. They would try to talk to the person who, leaked those reports. They would corroborate these reports with people who worked in the Defense Department, etc. And so there's a process of fact checking, of the verifications of the sources that you're doing, and the investigation that goes on as you are reporting out a story. And so that is a very important aspect of these journalistic standards. Another is that you're making sure that the reporting that you're due are based on factual claims, that the sources that you use are legitimate sources. Oftentimes, news reporters will not run stories if you just have one source, but you've got to have multiple sources who are saying the same things. That doesn't mean the multiple sources could all be lying. They very well could be, but that's not likely. I mean, you try to do your best to fact check your coverage, the reporting that you're doing. And that, they try to offer a balanced coverage. And so that if, on the one hand, they're saying that the Pentagon Papers are indicating that the Defense Department is, knowingly sort of pursuing an unwinnable war, a good reporting would look at the other side too and provide sources that, have a different take on it. And so, but how does this serve as a self-check on the news media? Well, it serves as a self-check because journalists are supervised by somebody. They're supervised by their editors. And the editors are supervised by the editors-in-chief, okay? And that before a story goes to publication, then is reported on broadcast news or cable news, the idea is that the editor holds the journalist's feet to the fire to make sure that they are doing the kinds of reporting that they need to do, that they're doing the fact checking. It's a self-check because if you're doing bad reporting, people aren't going to trust you anymore, and they're not going to continue listening to you, watching you, or buying your newspaper or buying your magazine. And so it is a sort of self-checking that goes on, but it's an important self-check because journalists pride themselves in having really high journalistic standards because they know when they lose those standards that they really lose credibility in the eyes of the public and political officials as well. Another check on the news media is the marketplace. And I put maybe that can serve as a check. Now, news media in the United States is not publicly owned. What do I mean by that? The news media is not funded by taxpayer dollars. We don't pay taxes into a fund that then gives those taxes to the news media. Other countries do it that way. Great Britain is a good example of that. They have the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. And the British Broadcasting Corporation is run by a nonpartisan, non-elected board. I mean, it's a private board that's, not subject to partisan influence. And they make programming decisions. But the money that the BBC gets is from the public, right? The people pay, and then they get the money, and then they do a wide variety of broadcasting. That's not how it's done in the United States. We do have a few examples of public broadcasting, right? PBS, NPR. But they make up only about 3% of all of the news media sources in the United States. And even the money that they get from the government is a small percentage of their overall operating budget. As you know, if you listen to NPR, they're always asking you to call in and donate money. That's the vast majority of where they get their money from. So the vast majority of news media is privately owned. It's a privately owned business. And like any other business, it needs revenue to survive. And where do they get that revenue from? Well, they get the revenue from consumers. People subscribe to magazines. People subscribe to newspapers. But most importantly, they that news sources need advertisers, right? You watch the evening news, they have advertisers. You watch CNN, they have advertisers. You look through a magazine, there are advertisers. And if advertisers don't think you have consumers buying your product, they're not going to advertise with you anymore, okay? And so in a way, that maybe the marketplace plays a check on the power of the media because they want to keep people consuming. And if people don't feel like they can trust the news reporting that you're doing, they're not going to consume. And if people don't consume, then they're going to lose advertising revenues. You need subscribers, eyes for ads, etc. So in a way, the market can serve as a check on the newspaper, on the news media. If the product fails to live up to journalistic standards, you're going to have a loss of readership, and that loss of readership is going to result in a loss in revenue. But let's keep it real. Good journalism doesn't always sell. In fact, sometimes when I can't sleep, I put on the News Hour on PBS because it's so dry and it can be kind of boring. Sorry for you lovers of the News Hour out there. But sometimes hardcore journalism can be quite dry, and you have to be pretty committed to following it. What does sell, though, is sensationalism, okay? There's an old saying in journalism: if it bleeds, it leads, right? If it's something blew up, somebody was killed, somebody was hurt, that's the story that you lead with because you want to hook people in. Weather and sports, that sells too. So sensationalism, breaking news, ideological bias, confirming what you already believe to be true, that actually works better for the marketplace than I'm going to purchase something because I feel like they're doing hardcore journalism that lives up to standards. No, a lot of times what sells is sensationalism. And so the market might not be providing the correct incentives to place checks on the power of the media. But you're a consumer, and if you find that there's a news source that you think does a better job in terms of hardcore reporting, living up to journalistic standards of objective media, maybe not now because y'all are youngins, but when you get older, make sure that that's what you're subscribing to. Pay for the media that you respect. So in conclusion, how would you evaluate the job that the news media is doing? Do you think they do a good job informing, investigating, providing a meaningful public forum for debate? Do you feel like they are living up to journalistic standards? Or do you even have a hard time figuring out whether or not they're living up to the journalistic standards we talked about here? Another thing is that distrust in the news media is high. Now, let's keep it real. Distrust in a lot of institutions are high in the United States. So the news media is another institution. But levels of distrust are high. In a recent Gallup poll from September 2020, it asked people about the level of trust that they had in the news media. And 33% of Americans report having no trust at all, none at all, when it comes to trusting the news media. And if you add in those that said that they had a little bit of trust, that number even goes higher, over a majority. So a lot of people in the United States don't trust the media. So think about, what impact does distrust of news media have on democracy? And furthermore, is there anything that we could do to increase the trust in news media? Okay, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.